Okay, so I kind of joined the Minor Prophets class later than most of you. I just came into it this quarter, and we only have 5 of the Minor Prophets to cover. Todd's already covered 2 of them in the last 2 weeks, to a couple of the shorter ones. We get into Hosea today. Now, it's the largest, or one of the largest, this and Zechariah, for 14 chapters. And so we'll spend a little more time on these 2 books, because there's a lot more there. Lesson 1 that was handed out to, anybody need lesson 1? Everybody got a copy of that? Okay, handed out on Wednesday night. We're going to spend the day there. It may go into the next lesson, class period a little bit. I don't know yet. We'll just kind of see how it goes. But the purpose today is to just understand a little bit of the background of Hosea. We're in Hosea. And just kind of get the background. To me, understanding the times that things were written and the reason some things are written are really important for understanding. And so that's going to be kind of our purpose today. Hosea. The word or the name Hosea means salvation in the ancient Hebrew. It's kind of interesting that the name of Joshua in Numbers chapter 13 or Jesus in Matthew chapter 1 come from the same Hebrew root word, salvation. And I mean, that's not a surprise for sure when we think about Jesus, but what about, Joshua? It's the same word. It meant salvation. He was the one who was taking over, leading God's people, the children of Israel, and leading them into the promised land. I suppose that would fit. But then here for Hosea, his name meaning that of salvation, or some have defined it as God is help. Kind of an odd phrase, but we get the point that would come with that. And so if you've looked at Hosea before at all, or know anything about the story surrounding Hosea, we'd have to say that Hosea's life is at the very least one of interest. It's one that'll kind of stand out to us. The time in which he lived was very challenging. He married a harlot by the will of God. This is what God wanted. How weird is that? And then the names of his children are all peculiar. But there's a meaning. There's purpose behind that. And so we know these things about Hosea. And really Hosea becomes not the main focus of all of the prophecy or the book. But he's certainly there in the early part, is setting the tone, setting the storyline up. Well, there's a lot of things we don't know about Hosea. There's, a lot of the key things of his life, like what about his early life? How did he grow up? Well, we don't know anything about that, or where was his home? No, we don't know that. Simple things such as that. But what God has told us about Hosea is what God wants us to know. What God has told us about Hosea are the important aspects of his life that fit into God's story. And so again, in the big purpose, sometimes where we have to kind of back up and think about this a little bit, it's actually God's story. It's not Hosea's story. Now, God is using Hosea to tell his story. And we're going to talk some about Hosea because he's an interesting character and some interesting things happen here. But in the big picture, this is a revelation of God's story. And that's what we have to be able to see. And so, what do we know about Hosea? Well, he was a dedicated servant of God. He was willing to deliver God's message. We know these things about him. He was willing to do whatever God would tell him or ask him to do. We know this about Hosea. This becomes very clear to us. Hosea has a very difficult message to deliver. And Hosea has to, in his life, become a symbol of God's disappointment with the children of Israel. He has to live that. So here are some things we do know about Hosea. And they're all just very powerful symbols. So these are things that'll really stand out to us. But then me turn this around just a little bit. I want us to think for a moment. So we've identified some of these things about Hosea and a little bit about his message. But if there were anything else that we think about Hosea's message, is there anything else that would stand out? Is there something else that we would think of as being really pertinent in God's message through Hosea?
Hosea chapter 2 has always told me more about the mercy of God than perhaps any other chapter besides the chapters about Jesus on the cross. I cannot read Hosea chapter 2 without getting tears in my eyes. That God would love these people as he did, to offer them the mercy that he did. It's just amazing.
Okay, I think just one of the huge standout points of Hosea is about God's grace and mercy. How incredible it is. Because I think we cannot go through this story, through this lesson, without thinking, why would God even offer mercy to a people that are so far removed from him, that have become so sinful and so evil? Why would God even offer mercy? But his grace and mercy becomes so very evident. I think we've said before, sometimes I hear people say, well, in the Old Testament, we learn about the severity of God. We learn about his judgment. In the New Testament, through Jesus, we learn about God's grace and mercy. Well, we do learn about grace and mercy through Jesus. I grant that point. But I'm afraid sometimes we fail to see God's grace and mercy throughout the Old Testament. And it's there in the most incredible way, in the most powerful way. And I think that'll come out as we read through this, the words of this prophet. God's mercy is so very real. And that'll be one of the most powerful points that stands out from our study here in Hosea. Okay, so like who penned these words? Just kind of a side point here, We don't really know, if Hosea was the one that penned all of these words or not, or if they're just a collection of his prophecies that somebody else wrote down. That's not identified to us there in any way, and I guess it really doesn't even matter. But sometimes in some of the prophets, it's indicated, it's by his hand. These are his words, or maybe these are words that he is sending. It's by written word. Some of the inspired writers, are sending something. In this case, we really don't know about that, and whether it matters or not, I don't really think so. But just kind of one of those sad points. But this, somewhere along the line, an editor of some sorts arranged the order of the things that we're reading. And you can pretty well find three distinct segments or sections in Hosea. You have chapters 1 through 3 that kind of fit together with a theme. And so do chapters 4 through 11. There might be some smaller segments within that, but 4 through 11 kind of make a segment there, a section, and then chapters 12 through 14. And the way I kind of see it broke down that way is because each of those sections ends with a word of hope. While there is judgment that's being made throughout this section, at the end of each section, there's in some ways God saying, I still love you. And I still want you to be my people. And I'm still calling you back. And I'm still willing to offer and extend mercy to you. And so that's kind of how I could see there being three major segments, throughout the book of Hosea. All right. Let's talk history a little bit here for a minute. And on the back of your outline, in fact, there's a timeline, except it's just so very small. It's really hard to see. And so I've got it up here too. And sometimes, again, for me, this kind of way my head works. I got to see the big picture of some things to sometimes understand the smaller story. And just to understand kind of where Hosea fits in the timeline. Now, this is not a complete timeline going way back here, but this is just the time of the prophets. And so this class has been devoted to the 12 minor prophets And as we call the major prophets sometimes, like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Daniel, Ezekiel, major prophets because those are larger books. Major prophets and minor prophets. The difference is the size of the books is primarily the difference there. And so just to see and kind of understand in this timeline, we have the kings of Judah right here in the blue. Of course, that's not all of them. The timeline goes this way too, but we're just focused on this period of time. So the kings of Judah here, the kings of Israel down here. And of course, primarily here, this is a letter addressing, the people of Israel down here. We can see on the timeline that time is running short for Israel, that is. The divided nation, Israel and Judah. Israel doesn't have much longer. We think about the history of Israel as the kingdom was divided. They never had a king where God said, and he was a good king. In Judah, they had some kings that were identified as good, but not very many. And sometimes even some of those who were identified as good were primarily good, but they didn't always get it all the way either. So this is all part of this story here as this is unfolding. And so the timeline here, probably the time of the writing of the book of Hosea is somewhere like 725, 750 BC, somewhere in that time frame. His lifespan, of course, was longer. A contemporary to Hosea would have been Amos, but Amos was about done about the time, when Hosea was a young man. But still, most would consider them contemporaries. And so we think about during this time frame also is when, Isaiah was busy prophesying, more so to Judah. So all of these things are going on. So when we look at the book of Hosea, like every other prophets and other books that we can look at, sometimes we get a little bit of tunnel vision of just all that's going on. Maybe it's not a book that's introducing us to all that's going on, but a segment of what's going on. And not to forget, there's a lot of other things happening too. There are other kingdoms, there are other kings, there are other events going on that may or may not affect the storyline of what we're looking at or what we're studying. So these are all things we kind of roll through our mind as we look at this. So we're very soon here to the end of the kingdom of Israel. Kind of a rapid digression of some things that take place here. When Hosea begins, Jeroboam II is king. And it's like, there are those that are really good at figuring out the timelines and the dates and all that. I'm not so good at that. You have to really kind of dig into those things. But just look into what some others say, some other scholars, and what they have to say. And then kind of a rapid succession of kings here. Things are coming to an end. Israel now is just so removed from God that evil abounds. And even though they would consider themselves a religious people, indeed they were, their religion did not include Jehovah God. They had plenty of gods. Idolatry was prolific in all that goes with it. And idolatry of the time, in so many ways, wasn't so religious at all in the way we might think of religion. There was a lot of sins involved in their idolatry and serving their false gods. And that's what Israel is doing. That's the state of Israel in the days of Hosea and the time of his writing. And so we think about, like some of the major prophets, in fact, all of the major prophets, as we see them in the Bible, in the order that they're placed here, all come before the minor prophets. That kind of messes with my head a little bit, because I get things out of order. And really and truly, three of the major prophets haven't even begun their work or haven't even lived yet when Hosea is writing. I kind of wish sometimes that they were just all in chronological order in the Bible. It would work better with my head that way. I mean, it's kind of like Ezra and Nehemiah, right? Okay, that's kind of on the front side, about a third of the way through the Old Testament, right? But the events that Ezra and Nehemiah are dealing with and what's written about them or by them, when is that? Look, they're way out there on the very end of the timeline. Remember? Because they're talking about and considering events about, rebuilding the temple and rebuilding the walls around Jerusalem, rebuilding. See, that's way out here. In the time they were contemporaries with Malachi, the last of the prophets, in the last book in the Old Testament. And timeline-wise, it's in the right spot. It's in the very end. But that was the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. But in our Bibles, we find them in front of all of these. That's just to confuse me, I'm sure. But just to get some things in order. And to try to understand again the people that Hosea is writing to. Okay, maybe not a lot of things here that you want to make comments about, and I haven't given you a chance. We're just downloading some information here, putting some things in place. Some thoughts or comments that you have. Anything you want to throw out there? Kind of tough, isn't it? Okay. Let's think a little bit more here. Just about, in fact, I hope this isn't turned into something boring to you, but again, just trying to put some things in order. I want us to go back and look at 2 Kings chapter 14 through 17. No, we're not going to read all the way through it. I just want us to reference it. And I guess I just want you to put your eyes on it. And to be able to think and to have in mind that here is the account of some of the things that we are talking about here. The sequence of these kings and when they reigned. And what kind of kings were they? Amos and Hosea prophesied to Israel, to the northern kingdom. That was their focus there. And Hosea only mentions one king of Israel in like his timeline, and Jeroboam. And maybe that's because if you look here for a second, he mentioned like Jeroboam. These other kings, he doesn't even mention these other kings. And I don't know why exactly, other than their reigns were pretty short. I think 10 years maybe about the longest of one of them, or 16 years perhaps. And some of them served just a very, very short time. It doesn't even mention them, which is a little bit peculiar to me, but I'm sure there must be some purpose and some reason behind that. But as you see this quick succession of kings, again, it helps to maybe illustrate just the weakness of Israel, during this time. And so in 2 Kings, chapter 14, about halfway through that chapter or so, it mentions Jeroboam the second king of Israel. And in verse 24 it says, he did evil in the eyes of the Lord and did not turn away the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, which he had called Israel to commit. Okay. If we know nothing more, if there was nothing else written about Jeroboam the second, we know he's a bad guy. We know that he does not follow God. He does not serve God. In chapter 15, verse 8 and following there, Zechariah, king of Israel, verse 9, he did evil in the eyes of the Lord as his fathers had done. He did not turn away from the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, which he had caused Israel to sin. Verse 10, Shallum, son of Jabesh, conspired against Zechariah, and he attacked him in front of the people and assassinated him and succeeded him as king. He's not the only king to be assassinated. In fact, this seems to be a really good way in this period of time to get rid of a king. And so some of these kings are not going to serve very long. Verse 13, Shallum, the one who just killed the previous king, reigned in Samaria 1 month. And he was assassinated and succeeded as king by whom? Let's see. Pekaniah. Pekaniah, chapter 15, verse 23. He reigned only 2 years. And evil king, did evil in the eyes of the Lord. Pekah, verse 27. Verse 28, he did evil in the eyes of the Lord. And then during his time as king, he served just a little bit longer. See, a couple of these kings don't even have names on the timeline. They won't fit. You know, 1 month, 2 years, you know, and they're gone. It's during the time frame right here of Pekah in 2 Kings chapter 15. And let's see, verse 29. In the time of Pekah, king of Israel, Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, came and took Ijon, Abel-Beth, and Maacah, and a number of cities here. He's invading this northern kingdom of Israel. And Hosea conspired against Pekah, verse 30. He attacked and assassinated him, and then succeeded him as king in the 20th year of Joram. So Hosea now, you know, kills Pekah, becomes the last king. There's some things that Hosea, you know, why are we even talking about this? Understand the time frame, understand what's going on, understand the circumstances, understanding that Hosea is prophesying in a period of time when he can see the end. He can see that the end of Israel coming. That's what's happening. That's the circumstances of what's going on right here. Isaiah and Micah were contemporaries who prophesied in Judah, the southern kingdom. So Isaiah is prophesying right here in this period of time. And so his message is, well, a little bit different, but just not necessarily a lot different. Go over to 2 Chronicles chapter 26. 2 Chronicles chapter 26. We'll pick up just a couple of points out of this. Setting the tone. Chapter 26. 2 Chronicles chapter 26. King Uzziah. Uzziah, verse 4 says, did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, just as his father Amaziah had done. He sought God during the days of Zechariah. That would another prophet, but not of the book Zechariah, who instructed him in the fear of God. As long as he sought the Lord, God gave him success. Uzziah did some good things. But do you remember also what Uzziah did? It says he was a good king. Well, he went to the temple and wanted to burn incense. The priest tried to stop him. Uzziah, it is not for you to offer sacrifice. It's not for you to burn incense in the temple. And he went on anyway. God struck him with leprosy, remember? And immediately. And at that point, it wasn't too hard to get him out of the temple. He was pretty ready to leave. But he died with leprosy. Okay? This is what's happening in the northern kingdom. Even though they had a king that did some things that was right, he still was not focused on simply serving God. Or as the text would say, his pride overtook him. He started thinking too well of himself. That's what happened with Uzziah. Jotham in chapter 27 became king, served for 16 years. Verse 2 says he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. But the people, however, continued their corrupt practices. And so while the king was trying to serve the Lord, the people in Judah still were not focused on God. That's what's going on. Chapter 28, Ahaz becomes king. And he did not do what was right in the eyes of the Lord. He walked in the ways of the kings of Israel, and also cast idols for worship, worshiping the Baals, burned sacrifices in the valley of Ben Hinnom, killed his sons in the fire. How evil is that? This is what's going on. This is the storyline. Chapter 29, Hezekiah becomes king. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. It was Hezekiah in Jerusalem who reinstituted worship to God that would have been pleasing to God. And probably was kind of like the last big stand of any king in Judah to really try to pull the people back around to God. All right. Just throwing all that out there. To understand the place and the time. To understand the things that are going on. As we talk about the days of Hosea. To understand what is happening. And so, to say the least, it was not a stellar time in the history of God's people. It was not a time that we can look at and say, here are people that knew God and who loved Him. And we can only make that judgment. We make that judgment based on what we can read about in history about their walk with God or their lack thereof. And sometimes judgments that are made by God through the prophets that identify absolutely that they were not walking with God. And so then for us to think about it and ask the question, why does that even matter? You know, why are these things important for us to know? God has written these things for us. God has shared these things with us, and God has a reason for everything He reveals to us. And these are things that we need to know. Okay. Hosea. Let's go to the book of Hosea. And I'm interested to hear from you. You know, if you've studied Hosea before and you just have some ideas about the book and what it's about, what would you say the book is about? Big picture. We're looking big picture here. What would you say, or how would you describe the book of Hosea?
God's fidelity to a unfaithful people.
Okay. So God is honest and pure with His people, though they are not to Him. All right? Good. What else can we say?
God's love for His people.
God's love for His people. Okay? Good. What else?
Righteousness of God.
The righteousness of God, which stands out even more compared to the unrighteousness of His people. Or we can say it the other way. Their unrighteousness becomes even clearer compared to God's righteousness. Okay? Anything else?
His purchase of His people.
Say it again.
His purchase of His people.
His purchase of His people. What He was willing to do to have them, to win them back, to give them a means even of coming back. So someone along the line, said Hosea is like a love story. And at first read of that, I kind of thought like, that just didn't quite sound right. I mean, I think I understood the point. But would you think of Hosea as a love story? What would you think to that? I mean, what do you think of a love story?
Reciprocated love between two parties.
Okay, yeah, love that's both have joined in. It's joint participation here. Okay, love story. Romeo and Juliet, love story. Hallmark Channel, love stories, right? I mean, it's like most people like a love story. I mean, even people that are not necessarily real sentimental in that way can appreciate a love story. There is something about that which is appealing to us and captures our attention, draws our attention. I wonder why. Well, why do you think that's the case? Why does a love story capture our attention? Why is that?
Catharsis. It's a deep satisfaction when it all comes together.
We find pleasure in that. It is something that is appealing to us, soothing, maybe. Most everybody can appreciate, if not love, a love story. Makes us feel good. It is that.
Usually it has a happy ending.
Okay, yeah. I mean,
I was going to say, it usually pulls at your different emotions, because a lot of times a love story is a love story because of all the hardships that happened early on that they were able to work through to get to the end.
yeah. I read a book not too long ago, Cold Mountain. It's kind of an old book now, 20, 30 years old, you know. And it is basically a love story in the Confederate War period of time and such like that. And so the love story part of that, which is all kind of interwoven in that, well, I got to be careful what I say here. Spoiler alert. When it got to the end, it was not the ending it was supposed to be. It was really disappointing in the end because the love story didn't have that happy ending. Something happened. And it was like, I'll never read that book again. Can't hardly recommend that book. It's not the way a love story is supposed to end, right? Because everything that we've said here is that it's soothing, it's happy. It brings us to a nice place, to a happy place. It's soothing. And that's what we think about with a love story. And so when we think about some saying, well, Hosea is a love story, my first thought was like, I'm struggling with this just a little bit. But in the big picture here, and we're trying to see and understand the big picture of this, God with his people, he is offering that opportunity of a happy ending. Of it being a love story, a relationship between his people, you know, and God, a relationship that ends with a happy ending. And in that way, I get it. I see the point. I get that. And so as we get into this book, I guess that's maybe where our head can be, and we can be thinking about those things. For sure, I want to end with this thought. It is God's story. First 3 chapters where it's going to tell us so much about Hosea and some things that God asked him to do. And our focus is a lot on Hosea, but we can't stay there. In the big picture, we have to understand and see this as God's story. And it's taking us to an end, to a conclusion that helps us to see and understand God and what he would want of his people. That's the big picture of what we have to see. It's about how God feels in his relationship, in this case with Israel. And we are introduced to the fact that God has emotions, that God has feelings. And maybe we have to think about that just a little bit. That God has feelings. We're talking about love stories, and why do we like a love story? Well, it's because we have emotion. We have feelings. And so does God. And sometimes I think that's a little bit hard for us to capture in our mind. And then in this love story, it is God who is the one who is rejected, the one who is put off, the one who is disappointed. He is the one who is hurt. And that's what we have to see in that story. Okay, we're going to make this a stopping point, as that bell's going to ring here in just a second. There's a little bit more in this outline, if you just kind of look at the outline. And we'll take up, just there in chapter 1, what is God asking Hosea. And hopefully now, Wednesday night will be opportunity for a little more discussion than what we've had tonight, this morning, which we've had almost no discussion. Just a download of information here. Kind of setting the focus of our timing and history and what's going on and why is God having Hosea write. Hopefully we have some of that in our mind now and we can use that. And so we'll go through chapter 1 and then have an outline here that'll take us into chapters 2 and 3. I don't think we'll get through that on Wednesday night. I don't know, we might. We'll just see just how that goes. But that's where we're going next. So if you take an outline with you, just kind of lead you through some of our thoughts, give you a chance to kind of get some ideas and thoughts together. And I hope and anticipate that as we get into our other classes, we'll have much more opportunity for discussion as we go along. I'm really glad you're here this morning. Thank you for coming. Here you go, Ben.